Part 3, Understanding Building Classifications. Now's probably a good time to pause for a break if you'd like one before we continue on. So what we will discuss, where to find information about building classifications, the 10 building classifications in the NCC, building classifications for mixed-use buildings and buildings with more than one classification, and applying this to different types of buildings. So what are the NCC building classifications? As we know, buildings are built to serve different purposes, so the way that they're designed and constructed also varies. Therefore, the requirements that they must meet also vary in terms of things such as size, space, facilities, light, how you enter them and how you exit from them, fire safety and structural strength. To be completely honest, as a practicing architect for over a decade, I can actually only recall from memory the classes of buildings that I've personally worked on. Like everything in registration, it's about knowing where to find the information that we don't know. There's a really great fact sheet for building classifications that sit under the resource section of the ABCB website. I've popped the link on the slide here. It's a really great one to have saved for reference. I personally saved it for myself, learning about it whilst writing this presentation. Building classifications within the NCC reflect this variation in the purpose of different buildings and the performance requirements that they must meet. Because buildings have different purposes, they also need to perform differently as a structure. They'll vary in their energy and water use, their requirements for safety and security, including ways to get in and out of the building, so access and egress, and they will vary by their need to resist fire and their structural strength. The NCC maintains and manages this variation in building purpose and requirements by grouping buildings by their function and use, assigning a building classification to each grouping, and then specifying particular performance requirements for each particular classification of building. Subclassifications such as 1A and 1B that you can see on the right there in Volume 2 are treated as separate classifications. So effectively, there are actually 16 building classifications and subclassifications. A performance requirement might apply to Class 1A or Class 1B, or it might apply to Class 1, which means that it applies to both Class 1A and Class 1B. Volume 1, which you can see here on the left, is usually thought of as covering commercial building classifications. Volume 2 on the right is thought of as covering the residential building classifications. You may have also heard people in the industry refer to this, to Volume 2 rather, as the housing provisions. This separation is not hard and fast. In particular, there are some disability access provisions in Volume 1 that may also apply to Class 1B buildings, which are otherwise covered in Volume 2. The NCC building classifications are not intended to cover every possible structure that might be built, just those common buildings that are covered within the NCC itself. Some types of less commonly built structures are not covered by the provisions within the NCC, so for example power plants or water treatment plants or bridges or dams. Different legislation in the different states and territories regulates the construction of these other types of structures. But what about Volume 3? As architects, we don't hear a lot about Volume 3. However, designers and builders building any class of building will need to refer to Volume 3 for performance requirements related to plumbing and drainage. So you can see here, Volume 1 covers Class 2 to 9 buildings, Volume 2 covers Class 1 and 10 buildings, Volume 3 covers plumbing and drainage requirements for all building classifications. Let's look at mixed-use buildings. In a mixed-use building, each part is classified separately according to its purpose. Each part must meet all the performance requirements for its particular classification. Generally, if a part of a building that has a different purpose is less than 10% of the total floor area of the story it is on, then it is not actually given a separate classification. The classification of the rest of the building or the space it is within will apply. So in the NCC, this is provided as an exemption to the clause A6G1. For example, in a single-story warehouse with an office that is 15% of the total floor space, the office space has a separate classification, Class 5, and that space must meet the performance requirements for a Class 5 building. If the office space was only 5% of the total floor space, then it would be classified, along with the rest of the warehouse, as a Class 7B building and would have to meet the performance requirements for a Class 7B building. If the warehouse had 2 stories and the office was 15% of the ground floor, but only 7.5% of the total floor space, then the office space would still be considered a Class 5 part of the building because it is the percentage of the floor space of the story it's on that matters, not the total percentage. The 10% rule doesn't apply to laboratories. A laboratory, which is usually a Class 8 building, is considered to have a higher fire risk, which must be appropriately managed. Treating a lab like another class of building would potentially mean that the fire hazard management measures might be inadequate for the risk the lab poses to the users of the building. Another example are sole occupancy units in a Class 2, 3, or 4 building. When a space is used for people to live in, the NCC mandates performance requirements to manage risks, such as for fire risks, and to ensure adequate sound insulation. Treating a sole occupancy unit like another class of building could mean reducing these requirements, which would result in a living space that failed to comply with requirements and lacked necessary amenities. The third is Class 9B early childhood centres. Early childhood centres generally pose a different set of risks, especially in emergency evacuation, than other building classifications. Treating an early childhood centre like another class of building could mean that the fire safety measures do not match the risk and occupancy characteristics of this building classification. There's more discussion of the 10% rule and the exceptions to the rule, and they can be found in the explanatory information in Part A6 of any volume of the NCC. Can a building have multiple classifications? Yes, it's possible. Let's use an example. Imagine a builder wants to build a building that has flexibility in its use. For example, it can be used for different purposes. For example, a building with a number of units in an industrial park. The building owner or developer might want to be able to sell or rent the units in the building for a variety of purposes, such as office space for small buildings, which would sit as Class 5. They might want to use retail space for businesses that will sell to the public, which is Class 6, or storage space, Class 7B. This is permissible, but the building must meet all the specific requirements for any class and the most stringent requirement for all the classes. So, for example, a storage space may not need to have a lot in the way of facilities, such as bathrooms, because typically few people work in these spaces. However, an office or a retail space requires a minimum number of bathrooms, and this is determined by the expected number of users and size. And because there is an expectation that some people will typically spend long periods of time in the space and that a larger number of people will use the space, therefore units would need to meet the more stringent facility requirements for Class 5 and Class 6 buildings. But what if a building's classification isn't obvious? Building classification is a risk management issue. The risk associated with a building's intended purpose needs to be assessed so that the building can be classified appropriately and built to meet the most appropriate performance requirements. When deciding on a building's classification, the appropriate authority reviews the building proposal and might consider things such as the intended purpose of the building and or different parts of the building, building classification that the building most closely resembles, likely fire load of the building, and likely risk to the safety, health, and amenity of the people that might use the building. They might also look at relevant decisions or determinations by appeals courts in the relevant state or territory. It's important to note here that not all appeal court decisions will set precedent. The definition of appropriate authority is slightly different in New South Wales. Some building regulatory authorities in some states and territories issue their own guidelines for building classifications. A building surveyor, known as a principal certifying authority here in New South Wales, is one of the main appropriate authorities to classify a building, but it could also be a council, and that this should be really confirmed with the local regulator. The building surveyor or certifier will approve a building's classification, including when different parts of a building have different classifications, and when a space or a whole building has multiple classifications. But you wouldn't really wait to submit a full application before getting an indication of the suitability of a building's classification if you have any uncertainty. It's really useful to get an indication of the likely decision before completing your documentation and submitting any authority approval applications. Let's look at a little scenario. A boarding house or hostel could be a Class 1B building or it could be a Class 3 building. But what are the key factors that determines its class? Height in stories. A Class 3 building is typically a high-rise building, while a Class 1B building is typically a low-rise building. We also look at who lives or stays there. A Class 3 building is designed to accommodate unrelated people, while a Class 1B rather, building may accommodate related or unrelated people. We also look at how many people it can accommodate in the total floor area. So a Class 1B building would normally not accommodate more than 12 people and would have a total floor area of no more than 300 square metres. If it's bigger than this, it would be classed as a Class 3 building. I have another true or false for you. A Class 1A residence cannot be built over or under another building or structure of any other class except for a private garage. This statement is true. If a residence is built over any other type of structure, it would be a sole occupancy unit of a Class 2 building. This is the case even if the structure is a common garage space. Let's have a look at a summary. Volume 1 holds Class 2 to 9 buildings and is known as the commercial provisions. Volume 2 covers Class 1 and Class 10 buildings and is the housing provisions. Volume 1 disability access provisions may also apply. And in Volume 3 covers plumbing and drainage requirements for all building classifications. So some key points. Building classifications are found in the governing requirements, Part A6 in all volumes. A mixed-use building may have parts that are different classification and the 10% rule applies. An entire building can have more than one classification if it is designed or intended for more than one potential purpose. If a building classification is unclear, refer to the appropriate authority in the relevant state or territory.